All right, well, welcome back. We're excited to have our next lecture in the Aspire 101 or Electrified Transportation Systems course. Thanks for joining. All those are able to join us here live, as well as those that watch remotely and watch this after the recording. I was just mentioning, for those that are enrolled in the course, please watch our communications and twist. You've got your next deadline coming up for draft reports and presentations for the final project. And today we're going to move on to our next guest lecture. Our lecture will be provided, and couldn't be more pleased to introduce Russell Fisher. He's here at Utah State University. He's an associate director for the center at the Center for Entrepreneurship. And he's going to be speaking today on entrepreneurial thinking and problem solving. And we were discussing this just a little bit before the class started. It's important that we all get thinking this way from the beginning, early in our development of new concepts and technologies. So it's an important topic and one that we hope you will all enjoy. Russell, with that, I think I'll turn it over to you.
All right, I really appreciate that. And I appreciate everyone here. I'm in a classroom because I just feel more comfortable in a classroom rather than just being in my office. And so I'm going to try and use the whiteboard and for a portion of this, but I also have a PowerPoint presentation to go through exactly what we were just discussing there with entrepreneurial thinking. So I'll give you my objectives here that I want to define business and entrepreneurship, not in kind of a Merriam-Webster's or Oxford English Dictionary sort of way, but mostly as a framework for thinking. And I want to talk about how this kind of entrepreneurial thinking, which is more of a go-to-market strategy, and design thinking, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. IDEO is, obviously a leader in that space, how these interact, and how this strategy, this go-to-market strategy, this entrepreneurial thinking and design thinking strategy is a useful creative exercise for almost all organizations. And one of the things I want for you to be thinking about during this are the applications and the work that you do. My background is primarily in marketing. I have worked, in many places around the world, and it's on marketing strategy. Typically, it's been in retail products and consumer products, and then in business-to-business consulting and finance. So I haven't worked a lot in what we call harder sciences, which a lot of you are in that space. But I know the principles that we talk about will be applicable to your thinking with this. And the core idea of this is who is this focused on, and what, and how is this kind of centered in the world that we live in, the things that you're working on. And so one of the things that I'll also do, I'm going to talk about just a framework for thinking that I use with my students. It's got a silly name. We'll talk about it later on. It's based off of a few other frameworks that we talk about in my classes. But I know that most disciplines have their own frameworks, and there are some things that kind of carry over and connect. And so if there are some frameworks that are similar, I'd love for those on this call to share some of those things, and we can have a discussion at the end. So we'll kind of just see how this works. But let me start by sharing my slides here. All right, so there's your cool foundational picture. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is actually the board game Monopoly. We're going to go there. Okay, so if you're not old enough to remember Stephen Wright, he was someone that kind of did one-liners. I think it's wrong that only one company makes the game Monopoly. But let's talk about Monopoly briefly. Monopoly is the most popular board game in the world in terms of one that has intellectual property. Chess is more popular, but this is one that someone created and someone owns the rights to make money off of that. And that company now is Hasbro. There's a complex history with that, but we're not going to go into that. But let's talk about the impact of this game in terms of the world. It's not a game that I think a lot of people like very much. There are a few people who do, but that's kind of what's weird about this whole thing. So the base Monopoly game has sold on average every day, 365 days out of the year. For the last 90 years, it sold about 8,000 units a day. Now, their sales information more recently has been pretty opaque, but we can estimate that in recent years, that 8,000 units a day is closer to 8,000 units every 6 hours is what it's selling. And considering, so Hasbro announced in 2020 that they had a great year. They made $1.8 billion mostly, and this wasn't total, this is just in their games division on the back of games that haven't changed in decades, like Magic and Monopoly, Operation Connect 4, Jenga. So that quote of 8,000 units for every 6 hours may be conservative considering those numbers. That would mean that Monopoly has a smaller sense of that pie or share of that pie than we would have expected. The reason why we know it's a huge number is that if many of you are familiar, that Monopoly Go launched last year. In its first 7 months, it made $1 billion. And then 3 months later, it had made its second $1 billion. Okay. And so I've got this question that I ask you here. What are books that have outsold Monopoly? There's 2 books that have outsold Monopoly, and that's the Bible and the Quran. If we talk about books that have like that in that space, intellectual property, the #1 book sold of all time is Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. Following that is The Little Prince. And they haven't sold nearly as many units as Monopoly has. The most sold book in the last 2 to 3 decades is J.K. Rowling's The Harry Potter and, technically the Philosopher's Stone, because that was its original name, but the Sorcerer's Stone sold 120 million copies. So I'm going to do a quick little poll here. So I'm going to look at your hands if I can. How many people have a copy, if you use the raised hand feature, how many people have a copy of Tale of Two Cities at home? Let's see if we have anybody that has that. So either you're not participating or no one's raising their hand. Okay. So I don't see anyone so far. All right. How many people have a copy of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone at home? Okay, a few. Okay, so we got some people there. All right. So we've got a few more with that. How many people have more than, say, 3 copies of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone? So let's see if you can get an answer to that. So the hands are going down now. Okay, so these are the most sold books. How many people have how many people have Monopoly at home? All right, so we've already passed Harry Potter. And how many people have, say, 3 or more copies of Monopoly at home? Okay, 2 people. And so that's the interesting thing. Whenever I kind of ask this question, that a number of people typically will have more than 1 copy of Monopoly at home. And I don't even think people play it that often. In terms of like J.K. Rowling's book, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, we have books like games like Scrabble, Clue, Battleship, Trivial Pursuit. All of these are in the range of how many sales that book has had. And then Candyland, which is just, a book or a game with literally no strategy whatsoever, has sold 50 million copies over its life. And so there's a kind of an interesting question about like, what is the deal with board games? Of the top 21 campaigns of all time for Kickstarter, 1/3 of them have been for tabletop games, and one of the others was a table for tabletop games. In case you're curious, the #1 Kickstarter campaign of all time was not a game, though, but it was a Utah and Brandon Sanderson with his new book. So we have games that are incredibly popular that aren't necessarily that well designed as games, but they're accomplishing some sort of benefit for people. You compare this to another game that I know about that's very well loved called Entrapment. It was designed by Richard Gall. He was a well-loved game designer. He passed away in 2020, about 2 or 3 weeks before the whole world closed down. So he was kind of forgotten during that time, but people love his game, and it just never was very successful. And so how do you have some games that are doing very well that aren't well designed, and some games that are well loved and well reviewed, and they just never take off? And so these are the 2 questions that I want you to think about as kind of a metaphor for some of the things that we're talking about. #1, why are board games which is a very mature industry that's still growing at high rates. Why is that still so popular? And better yet, part of that question is, what do they do? What problem do they solve? What job do they accomplish for people? And the second question is why do games that are, by all intents rather lamely designed, they're not very strategic, they're not fun to play, Monopoly or Candyland, why do they do so well when these other games just kind of sit in obscurity? So these are kind of connected ideas. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about. We'll answer those questions. And here's a picture actually of Entrapment from the top. And I think you can kind of see perhaps one of the reasons why it's not popular, even though it's a very well-designed game. So the first question we're going to, yes.
Just if you get to a stopping point, you do have a hand raised from the previous
Oh,
section.
I thought that hand was being raised about Monopoly. Tammy, did you have a question?
Oh, that might have been.
Yeah, so I don't know. So Tammy's hand is raised. If you have a question, let me know. I don't see the chat though, so if you'll interrupt me
if there are any, I'll interrupt you on the chat. You bet.
All right, so what we're going to ask now and talk about for the next little while is, what is a business? And I've got three things here, which are a value exchanger, an organization, and an organization that's both a value exchanger and that's customer centric. And so I'm going to leave this here, and we're going to talk about this. And okay, let me get my camera controls here. Great. Okay. So the first thing we want to discuss with this is that question that I posed here. What is a business? And so a business, we all know kind of what a business is, right? It's, I'm going to turn my screen so I can see. There we go. So a business is an organization, whether it's a small organization that we see on Main Street or a large multinational organization like Nike or Procter & Gamble. But that's not what I'm talking about in terms of just those organizations. What I'm talking about is, how do we define it at its base level? So business here is the organization. So that's what we're talking about with that slide. And in this organization, it needs to have some sort of, there's this kind of cycle that occurs where there is a product that it creates. And I don't really care if it's a product or service. And what it is this is something of value that changes somebody's life. And when we think about it, that every business is actually a service-based business, right? Because we have customer service, or we have distribution channels, or we have to actually take the order, right? These are all service aspects of a business. And then occasionally we have products that are also associated, these items that we can maybe ship from one place to another. But everything else about distribution and about the way we're interacting with the customer, that's the service side. So instead of just kind of talking about the differences between these things, we'll just call this all product, okay? So the business has to create a product, and that product is given to the customers this in terms of some sort of value. So it creates value for the customers, and that's these people over here that exist to say, I'm really happy to be receiving this sort of thing. I'm so happy that I'm going to affect some sort of like exchange of money back to you. Now, is it a direct exchange or a direct, connection from the business to the customer? Not always the case, because you use Google all the time and you don't really pay for Google all the time. You have advertisers that pay for that. But we do have, in order to be successful, the business has to create something of value. That value has to go to what we call a customer, and we could spend days and days defining what a customer is. It's an old kind of borrowed French term that means someone who goes to the same place over and over again and buys stuff. But we'll talk about another way I like to think about it, which is the word custom, about the way that this person or these groups of people are trying to accomplish something, and we need to understand what that custom desire is. And then they, in effect, give money back to us so that we can continue to exist, okay? So that's all business is. And so when you have a business and you think about it in a broad term, that means that lots of different things can be businesses. That a university can be a business. Its customers could be, at some regard, they could be students, and students pay tuition, but the tuition obviously doesn't cover the whole cost of Utah State. So we have taxes and we have donations, and maybe our customers are people going to our games, and so it's ticket sales or merchandise sales. But these are all ways that we are trying to accomplish some kind of value, give some kind of value to a customer, and that customer, in effect, gives us, helps us to get cash to continue to exist. So whether this is a school or a church or a board game or a band or a dentist practice, these are all different types of businesses. And when we use that as a framework of thinking to say, my job for me as a part of this organization is to create something of value for this external person, and then find a way that that creation of value creates revenue or donations or money back to me, then I can use business thinking in all that I do in terms of my interactions with the customer. And so that's why I think about it in terms of that kind of that value exchange going back and forth. And so when we think about this, this is in order for us to understand this customer, and I'm going to bring this up and talk about this in a little bit more detail, we need to understand what is the customer getting out of this situation. So I want you to think about whatever you're working on, the things that you're working on right now. I'm going to go grab my notes here so I can see them a little bit better. I want you to think about, like, what are you working on and who is this benefiting, or who will it benefit, and how are you interacting with that person, okay? So our businesses need to create value. They need to be organized, and they need to be customer-centric. And that customer-centric approach, that arrow that I had kind of put here already, we want to think about that in two ways, which are problems that can be solved. So I'm going to put problems here, and jobs to be done, okay? Now, sometimes when we're thinking about businesses or products, we kind of just say, well, these are almost the same thing, that someone has a job that they're trying to accomplish, meaning they're trying to accomplish something in their life, or they have a problem that they need to be solved. And so these are kind of different ways to say the same thing. But I kind of like to think about it in a different way. So for example, if you're cold outside, that's a problem. What might you do? You might put on a jacket, right? And so the problem is kind of maybe a trigger that occurs. That you're in some kind of experience, we call that a window of opportunity. You're having some kind of experience where you might need to act in a certain way. So around the holidays, you need to buy presents. When it's, the sun's coming out, you need to wear sunscreen. When it's cold, you start thinking about putting on a jacket. And then we might have something that triggers that. Now, strictly speaking, in business, we say those triggers might be advertisements or something, but it's just this way that we act. We're choosing to act as consumers to try and solve our problem, okay? So usually this is something that's this external kind of stimulus or experience that causes us to think we need to change our life, okay? And so every business needs to be focused on solving that problem first. I'm going to put S, solve. That's kind of an old debate thing, to put an S with a circle on it, to solve that problem. So that's our first kind of approach. That's our bare minimum. If we have a restaurant, we better have food there, okay? Now, on the other side of this are jobs that need to be accomplished, meaning that in addition to getting warm, the jacket has to have all sorts of different functions, or it's not going to be helpful for the customer. So the jacket, you can get warm with a good hug or a blanket or whatever, but let's talk about the jacket in particular. What does it need to do? So we're going to talk about in terms of, there's like utilitarian jobs. I'll get out of the way of this. We have social jobs, and we have emotional jobs. There are other jobs that exist besides these ones, but these are kind of generally the easiest to understand. So utilitarian jobs are just, there's some utility there. There's something very simple to understand. The jacket needs to be easy to put on. It needs to be something that stays on our body. It needs to keep us warm. It needs to maybe keep out the wind or the rain. The social is, how does this help me in terms of my connections with others? So if I have a jacket that has a sports team on it, or shows that I have a certain amount of understanding of fashion, right? Or it connects me that I have a look that I'm going through that I'm trying to communicate to somebody else. And we all do this with our clothing all the time, even if we're saying, my communication to you is that I don't care about clothing, so I'm better than you or whatever. And then emotional is about how that makes us feel, right? And so the social is this external look and emotional is this internal look. I like the way it feels because it makes me feel comfortable or confident, or it makes me think about my dad, or it makes me feel like I can handle the rain and the wind or whatever, okay? So jobs accomplished, there are these jobs that the jacket is accomplishing both. There's the original problem, there's these utilitarian, social, emotional jobs that nearly everything that we consume in our lives are fulfilling those, either solving those problems or fulfilling those jobs. So let's go back to the board game. Why do we play board games? And I think we can get similar answers. If anyone wants to guess a few answers, let's take a few guesses on there. So in the chat, or you can speak out. Why do we actually play board games? What are maybe the problems that we're trying to solve or the jobs that we're trying to accomplish with these board games? And how does maybe understanding that help us to understand why a game like Monopoly does very well and a game like Entrapment does very poorly? Besides the fact that Monopoly is in like Walmart and everything, let's think about just in terms of its base function or its base, design. Why does it do well and another one does poorly? So let's see if we have any thoughts here. I'm moving over. Let's see. Okay. I can't see my mouse.
So far, you've got competition from Liam.
All right. Okay. So you said competition. Okay. Yeah, somebody else could do that. My mouse is not showing up right now for some reason, so I can't actually see. So Liam says that. So I'm guessing what you're saying is that you like competition. Then, so you're trying to find a place where you can compete with others. So maybe that's a social or emotional type thing, right? Is that I'm looking for a place that I can compete. Okay. And so both games do that, but that's one thing. And that means that when we think about board games, that board games are not necessarily in terms of the business space competing against each other all the time, that they might compete against anything that creates competition, right? So a board game one night, if we get together with a group of people and we're trying to maybe be social and competitive, we can go play pickleball or we can play a board game together. And when you're designing the board game, you're not thinking, how's this going to beat pickleball? But at that evening that you're together, that's going to be a competitive thing. Okay, what else? Let's see here. I wish I could see my mouse. Okay.
You see it? You want me to read the next one?
Yeah, if you could. Yeah, my mouse is just not showing up, so I don't know.
You bet. So Dane says easy to play, which means that it's easy to use as a social tool. Any guest you have over, you can bring out Monopoly compared to, say, chess.
Okay, cool. Yep. So games, but games in general can be an easy way to connect with people, right? So what else? What else can Monopoly do? So yeah, that's one thing that you're talking about, that because everyone knows how to play Monopoly, that it's easy to connect. Anything else? Our next ones?
No, nothing else just yet.
Okay.
You've
Well,
got
the other thing I would talk about with this is that Monopoly is also something that puts you in a world, right? We saw the video or the picture before of Entrapment, a well-designed game, but it was just blocks. But Monopoly puts you in this world where you're thinking about, like, I'm taking over this like blue section, like, Park Place and Boardwalk or whatever, that you actually get to experience this little world for a little while. And so it's this kind of imaginative thing that exists. I mean, that's got to be the only reason why Candyland sells, is that it puts little kids in a magic world of Candyland, because there's nothing else about it. You're just flipping over colors and moving from one place to another. And so when we think about games, we tend to think about them in terms of like how they help us to be strategic or competitive or whatever, but sometimes it's literally just an imaginative escape. And sometimes a game like that might be an easier thing to do than having make-believe play or going all over the house to play hide and go seek, that you can contain this in this small area where people get to escape to a world together. And you don't have to go to Disneyland to do that. And so when you think about it in that regard, that these games in themselves, that they represent a lot more than just, the cardboard or the mechanisms that they are built with or that they're designed with, that they represent an escape or a competitive set or a family night. And they all represent all these things to different people. So how do we understand like what we need to do to create? We have to understand the customers and what they're trying to get out of this. So when we talk about games in this situation, we're talking about like lots of different customer groups. And so I'm going to move forward and talk a little bit about like.
You have one more if you want to hear it.
Okay, what was our last one there?
Matt, you want to say it?
Sure. Yeah, so I wrote it's low effort and it's not mentally taxing, which means that, if the main goal of your get together is to talk or socialize, then you can do that. And it's sort of a background thing. You don't need to focus very hard on it. And so it's something to do and focus on if there's a lull in the conversation, but you can still have a conversation while you're playing Monopoly or Candyland.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if you're playing chess, you've got to focus the whole time, right? But if you're playing Monopoly, you can just sit there because you only have to make the decisions. I mean, you can hate it, but you only have to make decisions one time after another. So it's interesting that Monopoly as a term of a social gathering tool or as a way to have entertainment that evening might be better than a lot of other things out there, even though its main thing as a game is not the best, it's not the best mechanism or the mechanics. And so it's kind of interesting when you think that, and this is something that we deal with sometimes when we're saying it's not good enough, the thing that we're creating. And the real answer is it good enough for the people that you're trying to solve the problem for? Because if it's good enough for them, you actually are good enough, right? We're not being someone without integrity. We're saying we have a group of people that are looking for something and we're trying to deliver that. And the reason why we know that's important is that there's this whole idea of what's called disruptive innovation. And disruptive innovation, coined by Clayton Christensen, most of us have probably heard about it. But the core idea of this is that when we create technologies, we tend to have a technology that eventually outstrips the needs of the customer or the consumer. And when we outstrip the needs of the customer or the consumer, there's a lot of waste associated with that. And so if something comes in that's less expensive, has a better cost structure, the consumer is going to go to that. And so the popularity of smartphones since 2007 or so, when the iPhone first came out, was not based so much on the fact that it was a really cool phone, but more on the fact that it was a really inexpensive computer that could give you access to networks in places that you couldn't have access to, which is why we have 90+% of the world has smartphones right now, even if they're in very impoverished conditions, because as a computer and as a network, it's a lot less expensive to fulfill the needs of maybe being connected or having news or playing games or having media. Those sort of, even though it's not the ideal in any of those situations, for a lot of people it's good enough, and they've gone to that to say that's actually solving my problem better. And so what we want to think about is, what are they actually trying to accomplish, and how are we solving the problems, and how are we helping them to get the job done that they need to. So there's a few things that I want to talk about in relation to this, is that what do we need to have in order to be successful in designing a product or solution for a customer in a way that we think can be viable in the future? And so that's the same sort of conversation that we might have about what will make a business successful. The executive director for Entrepreneurship is Mike Glauser. And he, a few years ago, took a bike ride across America and interviewed 100 different small businesses in all these locations across America to find out what was consistent about what made them successful. These are people who chose to be in a small town, and what did they need to have to be successful? We learned some things about that they need to have passion and purpose, but there are a few kind of really kind of basic ideas that have come out in terms of like the things you have to hit in order to be successful as a business. And side note, we're doing that bike ride again this next summer, but for another purpose. So you can look that up later on if you wish to. So the first one is need, which is similar to the problem or the job. A successful product, a successful business, and a successful solution to a problem in the world, it needs to solve a real need that exists. I work with a lot of people that will make a solution to maybe something that is only their problem, or maybe it's based off of a really cool technology, but they haven't connected that technology to an actual need that exists in the world. And a lot of times it's like that game that we're talking about. It's not understanding that people aren't necessarily only interested in mechanics, but they're actually interested in the imaginative or the creative part of the game. So why, what problems or what gaps are in a customer's life, a potential customer, that you can help overcome? And so this is when we start doing our brainstorming. This is where we start to be really adaptive and creative in this space. And so this is where creativity is kind of guiding us to say, okay, let's think outside of kind of our experience and trying to connect to others, this really customer-centric experience, and say, what problems do you have? Now, one of the things that we've learned is that you can't actually ask people all the time what problems they have, because they don't tend to think about it that way. They just think about that they exist in this world and they're trying to take care of things, and they usually kind of hack around like solutions to their problems. So while conversations are good, it's also incredibly effective to just kind of observe and to watch people. If you have a technology that you think might have application or at least some experience in an area, which will be our second place, by the way, which is to say that you have some sort of experience in something. If you have an area that you know, or that you can innovate in that area, what you want to do is you want to observe people and to see how they interact with other solutions that are kind of in that space. And this is something that, back to board games, that I kind of learned. I decided a few years ago, I teach a class in startups, and I thought, well, I'm going to do a small student-sized kind of startup, which was, in this case, it was a board game, which is why I know a little bit about that. And so I thought, if I can do something that cost me a few $100, let's see what I can do in a few months to launch this thing. So one of the things I did, because I'm not actually huge in the board game space, I just knew that that was something that I could bring to market rather quickly. I called a board game convention and I said, hey, I'd love to teach a class on how people can start, a board game company, because I knew I could just teach them the principles of entrepreneurship. So they said, that's great. We have a lot of people like that. Why don't you come? And I said, so I came and I taught that class, and I thought, as a result of this, I'm in here now, I'm just going to watch people. So I watched them for 2 days, and most of the people there were playing these board games. That's kind of mostly what they did for 2 days. And I kind of watched to see how people would group. And I found that there was one group of games that weren't being covered, meaning that the needs of certain customers weren't being accomplished. So one area that they didn't do a lot there, but I know is a big area, and this is kind of connected to what you do, are they're party games that you can get together. You don't have to think a lot. They're really interactive. You think like Apples to Apples or Pictionary or something. Those are games they wouldn't play at the board game convention, but I know that's a pretty big market. And so it's like, okay, that market's been taken care of. And then there's games like Monopoly or Connect 4, these really classic games that have a really low barrier to entry, and people play them maybe a few times a year around, the holidays or something. But then there's these people there that were playing these games that they were happy to play that might take them, 4 hours, or some of these things up to 40 hours. And they're just playing this one game, these kind of Euro style, highly complex games that were highly strategic. And that's what they really enjoyed doing. But I realized there was not a space of people who wanted to have a highly strategic game that had a low barrier to entry that wouldn't take your whole, night or next 2 days. And so that's what I started exploring, is to see like who's in this space and what could we do to kind of solve for, missing needs in that space. And we had a successful launch as a result of that. It was just based off of a simple concept. I'd read this paper from this 1930s Princeton game theory paper, and they said, what would the most ideal strategic game look like? And I said, let's use that and kind of riff off of that game. And so that's what I did. I got some play testers together, and we had this really complex game. And then they kept saying, I only like this one portion, not the others. And that's back to that good enough. And we said, okay, let's just make a game based off the stuff they like. And people really liked it. I mean, I don't even advertise this thing, and I'm still selling it, which means I probably need to focus on it a little bit more. And so that's something that I've thought about a lot, is about these missing needs that are in that space. So then we go to experience. Do we have experience in this space, or can we gain experience? So I didn't have a lot of experience in the board game space. So I went and observed people. I went and talked to people who were experts in the field. And I knew a little bit about design. And I knew a little bit about, strategy has always been something that I've been interested in. So I kind of focused on those areas that I knew. So if we went into some other more complex, like a party type game, kind of an introvert, I get freaked out at parties. And so that wouldn't have been my thing. So I'm focusing on the areas that I like, which are games that I can get into quickly, that are strategic, but I don't have to basically give my life to that to understand how to be really, really good at it. I think somebody said once that everybody should be good at chess, but an expert is an example of a wasted life or something. I don't know if that's actually true, but I think it's this idea that if you want to be really, really good at some of these things, you have to commit a lot of time and energy. And I just wasn't willing to do that. The next area we have to be successful are resources. What do we have around us? What do we have access to that can help us to accomplish the goals, the products that we're trying to create or the solutions for these customers? So on this call, I'm sure that a lot of you have the resources of each other, or you have access to experts, you have access to equipment that you need, or to those who to maybe into distribution networks, and in some cases money. These are all resources that we need to launch businesses. I don't think it's as applicable for what we're talking about to generally with Aspire, because these are kind of bigger things. But I know that most things that we talk to our students about on the undergraduate level is to say, we believe that any business can be started with about $600. And so if it's a highly, very tech intensive business that requires a lot of coding, you better have a, coding, co-founder with you so you can offset those costs. But we've had that proven a few times that we've got students that are running businesses that, students right now that have started businesses for $600 or less that are making tens and hundreds and even of thousands of dollars, and even plus $1 million as active students. And that's kind of a fun thing to see, that if you kind of take something small, try and improve the model, you can start to get more resources as you move forward with that. All right, our next one is customers, meaning, do we have enough people? And I'm going to go back and talk about this. Do we have enough people to make this viable? And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that, and then we'll have some more conversations about this. So I'm not going to talk about that a lot now, but this is really this is essential thinking for the beginning of launching a business. These are all things that you can kind of like guess or measure. You can see how much of a need there is out there by talking to people, your experience and resources. But customers is one that you usually can't know just off the bat. You've got to observe, you've got to talk to people, you've got to get involved in who might be benefiting from this. And the last one is model, meaning, do we have a way that we can make money? So how do we generate revenue? Whether this is a nonprofit or a university or a traditional business, you've got to have that kind of set into place to say, I know how to make money off of this. We do have people that, kind of in that tech space that will launch something, maybe it's some kind of online platform, but they don't know how they're going to charge. They don't know, what is the value to a customer enough that they'll get paid, or is there anybody else that will benefit from this sort of thing? So we need to start thinking about this earlier on, but it's not really something that we're going to spend any time on talking today, okay? All right, so we'll talk about at the very end here, and I don't have a ton of stuff left to talk about this, but when we're talking about customers, this is where the bulk of your thinking should be if you want to have something that is not just a hobby, a technology that's a hobby, or this really cool thing that you developed and then nobody ever knows about, to something that could have an impact on the world. So the first thing we need to do is we need to find the who that's going to benefit from this thing. Any sort of technology needs to say, any sort of innovation needs to say, who is going to benefit from this? And we need to be very, very, very specific with this. Now, I was talking with some students earlier today, and I said, okay, who is your market? This was for a product for shoes. And they said, it's women that wear long boots. And I go, that's a massive market, and they all talk in different ways. They don't shop the same way. What is the group of people that are acting in similar enough ways that we can say, I'm going to combine you together so I don't have to talk to each one of you individually? And so that's our first thing that we start to do, is we start to say, let's think about this in terms of groups of people. We call those, of course, market segments. And when we go after one market segment, that might be our target market in that situation. But an 80-year-old and a 16-year-old don't act like each other, even if they live in the same area or have, they cheer for the same team or they're the same gender. They don't tend to act or talk to each other in the same way. And so if there's any change that you need to do in the way the product is communicated or the way the product is distributed, or the way the product is supported. That's a different group of people that you're thinking about. And we want to kind of segment those into kind of buckets. So we can say, okay, generally this bucket acts in this way, this bucket acts in this way, and so on. Once we figured out our bucket, that's our who, then we need to start interacting with them. And that's where we go into this kind of design thinking model. So this is based off of kind of IDEO, which is, I'm guessing most of you know about this incredible design organization. And it's a human-centered approach to innovation. Okay, so we try to understand human need, which is empathy. And then we do rapid prototyping, iteration, and we move forward with that. So to see if it's going to be desirable and feasible and viable. So I give my students, in terms of this design thinking, 5 areas. And I'm not going to go into them into detail, but I call this the aglet approach. And I'll tell you why. I'm going to do a raise of hands here. Who knows what an aglet is? A-G-L-E-T. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So I'm guessing those 4 are probably in their 20s. These are students. Is that right? Any of you disagree with me? Yeah. Okay. I saw a hand. It's like I said, my mouse isn't working, so I can't see where it is. But yeah, so I guess that you guys are in your 20s if you know what an aglet is. So the reason why I'm guessing most of you know what an aglet is who raised their hand is that there was this Phineas and Ferb music video about aglets, this whole episode. And so it's kind of an interesting question that you ask to say, like, it's kind of a generational gap type question. So the aglet is interesting because they sold this idea of what it was so effectively that people will never forget what an aglet is, which is the end of your shoe. It's this, or the shoelace is like the little plastic part at the end of your shoelace. So that's what your aglet is, and maybe you won't forget that now. And so when we talk about how do we communicate and how do we understand customers, we use the aglet approach because it's kind of a fun thing to think about. So the first thing we think about is our audience. Who are we talking to? What are they like? Let me see. I think I'm running out of space here. I'll go back to here and erase this. So the A is audience. So I want you to think about this in terms of whatever you're working on right now. Who is your audience? Okay, your audience. And when we talk about who is your audience, it means, you know, what does the customer profile look like? What are their demographics, the things that you can describe like, you know, in the census data, their interests, their online behavior? What are their pain points? What are their needs and desires? You've got to understand all those things. You got to talk to them and figure this out, okay? This, you need to understand their motivations, what is really important in their life in regards to what you're trying to work with them about, okay? How do they spend their time? What are their political leanings? Because that can help you understand like what media you should use, or you know, what kind of words you should use in conversation with them. How do they consume information? So we want to have a full understanding of who our audience is, okay? With that audience, we do what's called empathy mapping, where we try and understand, you know, what are they saying? What are they doing? How are they thinking? How are they feeling? Those are you know, a part of that part, okay? So if you are working on any incredible technology, you got to start doing that right away. The second one is goals, okay? So this is in terms of how do we interact with people? What is our goals with, if we're trying to do like a marketing campaign with them? What are the metrics that we use to define success? And so we need to make sure that we're going to say, okay, if we want to bring something to market, if we want to change someone's life, how do we determine if it's being effective? And so early on, you need to figure out what are those metrics and how will they kind of help you to know if you're succeeding. The next one was kind of a stretch, but I wanted to use it, was leverage, meaning how do you sell this in a way that they care about you? Okay, what can you leverage? And so we talk about your unique selling point, or another word for this is value proposition. Basically, what that describes is what makes your product better than the alternative out there. How is it solving problems? How is it giving you additional advantages? How is it reducing pain points better than anything else out there? And recall that when we talked about a board game, that a board game might compete against a pickleball game. depending on what the customer is wanting. So you need to understand your customer and say, okay, how are they trying to solve the problem that we're trying to help them to solve? And so your customer might be a community, or it might be, you know, a business, you know, a business to business type structure, but they still have these pain points that they're experiencing, these needs that they're trying to accomplish, and so on. All right, the next two are experiment. And with experiment, this is about conversations with your customers to see if your assumptions are correct. And then testing is getting your product out there in some kind of minimal viable way and seeing if there is any kind of, you know, uptick with this product. Okay, we need to see, you know, we need to go through this approach to consistently connect with our audience and say, is this working for you? And is this, are we on the right track to solve your problems? So my question to you is how does this relate to the way that you think about things in engineering or other areas? In what ways are you currently connecting with your end users? And what are some ways that you think about that you could do better in this? So I'm going to open this up for conversation and any questions that you have. And while you're kind of thinking about that, I'm going to try and find my mouse so I can look at things as well. So what are you doing right now, and how does this relate to some of the frameworks you might think about in terms of creating new products or innovating in your, you know, different responsibilities? There we go. I got it to work. Okay, we had Phineas and Ferb from Connor and from Anka. Is it Anka? All right. Anybody right now? What are you guys currently using in terms of trying to connect with your end users or your customers? Well, that's your problem. If nobody has any way to do that, then that might be something to focus on. So I'll give you guys a second. All right. So while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to end in saying that having this customer-centric approach, this can change a lot of the ways that you approach, or that you develop and innovate and iterate in terms of new products and technologies. I've worked with a lot of people that have, you know, developed without considering what impact it has on the world. And then when you talk to them and say, okay, how is this going to be used? They're just lost with some sort of solution. So I've worked with students here who create you know, some new technology, and I'm trying to decide if I can be specific about it or not, which is why I'm kind of hesitating. But they'll create a new, really kind of innovative technology and then what we need to do is we need to sit down and say, okay, who is going to benefit from this sort of thing? And so I don't feel at liberty to talk about some of these things. But if you guys have some examples of this, then we can talk about that in some detail right now. So, all right, I've got one that I could bring up. Okay, go on, Reagan.
I was going to say, one thing we've done is we spent time with potential customers. For example, we have a pilot project looking at using our charging technology for trucks.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our partners is one of our industry partners, Kenworth. And we're looking at a deployment of that technology in Utah. So they came down, and together we met with one of the potential end customers, spent about a day with them talking to their fleet manager and fleet operator, and just understood how the program operated. And then they, over a couple of shifts, they went and spent a couple of evenings just running the routes with the truck drivers, to talk with the truck driver, see how the route runs, see what they, you know, talk to them about the technology that we're thinking about, and just see what would work and what wouldn't work for them.
Yeah, and so do you mind if we talk about that for just a second?
You bet.
So what, so in terms of this technology, what is Kenworth getting out of this that, and you said it's with Kenworth specifically, which is a manufacturer, right?
Yes.
Yes.
I smiled just thinking, I wonder what I should say and what I shouldn't have, but yes.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so that's, you know, that's an interesting thing. Like, what does a manufacturer get out of this? Because, you know, why do they care about this on a day-to-day basis?
Right.
And maybe you can't talk about this, but that's what, you know, that's what I would do with these things, is say, like, what is this, why is this, why would they even be interested in this sort of thing? And as we start to do this, we can start to think of some other maybe applications. I've got a technology I can talk about. I was just thinking through because it's just kind of well known. We had a Shark Tank pitch last night. We have a student that has created a new artificial intelligence kind of scanner that censors YouTube videos. So the application is pretty simple for us to think about. It's with parents that have their kids watching YouTube, and then you can run this application and it censors a YouTube video so that they don't hear swear words. That's the idea of it. And so I was talking to him today and a team and saying, okay, what are some social media campaigns that you can put together with this sort of thing? And the focus has always been about like that technology, about how it solves these problems with these kids. And we've talked about like, if it's going to solve problems with these kids, you've got to have it running all the time, and it's got to be pretty accurate because it's a safety net. And so we understand that application. We said, what's interesting about this is that there's this other completely different application, which is to say, how do we get some attention for this sort of thing? And which is you can actually customize the application to take out any words that you want to. And so you could use this in sort of like a comedic way for, if anyone's ever seen those videos on unnecessary like censorship, where you could take Bluey videos and you could say, I'm going to censor every time they say, bingo or something in that regard, and do it as something that's for fun. And it's just by talking to people to say, okay, well, what are some other applications that you can use for this? And because at its core, he's just finding certain words and he's getting those words replaced, right? Or removed. And you can use this to replace to get any words that can be removed. And so if you start to think about it in terms of not just like something that censors videos, but an application that listens to videos in real time and helps you to kind of filter those videos in real time, there's a lot of different ways that this technology can be employed that might be really helpful. And that's just by talking to customers. And as we start to look at these things, one of the things that we tend to do is we get hyper-focused on the way that we think about the solution. And as we start to talk to people out there, we might start to think of either A, like I was talking about with Kenworth, there might be other things we bring in to create a full solution for this, or B, there might be other applications for this that we never even thought about from the very beginning. Because I have to think that, with some of these charging, these technologies that, we're thinking about maybe transportation companies, or we're thinking about, municipal, I'm guessing municipal like transportation districts and so on. But if we start to say, okay, well, really, what are you getting out of this, and how can we help? What are some other places that might find that problem might exist? We have a much broader way that we can implement these solutions.
So great points. And another challenge we often run into in that line of thinking is we're looking to solve a societal problem, for example, and that might and to do so might require large scale. And so that's what we're thinking about. But like you say, there may be other markets and other opportunities, and it may be that with those opportunities might be the necessary stepping stones, because the large market, it probably wasn't ready for it. It wasn't proven well enough. And so it may be that we need to find these smaller opportunities and nearer term markets, less risk than a large market that might not be ready for a new technology yet.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit about when telegraphs were kind of employed across Europe, and the countries wouldn't connect them to each other. And so it was like, well, I guess this failed then. But then I think it was Reuters that came in and said, well, I like this technology. It would work best if it was, broadly, there was this broad infrastructure, but it's not there yet. So what are some ways that we can kind of use the new with the old with this sort of thing? And so what they did, I believe, is they used like carrier pigeons to go from one telegraph center to another telegraph center. And it got their information across the continent a lot faster. And that, I think, not only helped them in that situation in that near term, but also proved that telegraphs were kind of something that was viable. And I think it encouraged people to kind of spread those in different ways. And so I do think that we start to look at these different, as we start to talk to people, if we try to do something too big, a lot of times we're designing it's harder for us to design a solution that it creates real solutions, I think, in the future. So
Thank you.
any other thoughts with this?
So is it better to start with a customer and say, hey, Kenworth, what do you want? And then, try to see if there's something you can do to fit their needs, or is it better to say, I have the ability to do this. What's everything that could possibly, what's every application for this thing that I can do? Do you start with the customer, or do you start with, some product and then try to find customers, or vice versa?
Well, I think most people in this space, in my space, would say you start with the customer first, but I don't think that's honestly true, because I think you start with what you're good at. And so a lot of people on this call, I believe, are good at technology, at developing innovative new ideas. And if you're good in that space and you have something that can be innovative, like whether in this case it's like charging, then I think you develop kind of some level or some some kind of portion of that, not the whole thing, because I think that's problematic. But you say, okay, we've got something that's kind of innovative and creative here. Let's create this, and now let's start doing that kind of brainstorming to see where we can apply this. I mean, there's no way that I think the world understood the application of artificial intelligence. I mean, we've even talked about it for decades. But with some of the recent innovations in that space, we've now, because the technology exists and the possibilities are there, we're able to see so many different applications. We saw this with blockchain as well. But I think the risk is, if you don't get somebody involved early enough on, then you are creating a solution for something that, A, might not be the real solution, or B, might not be the market that has the greatest benefit. I have something I think I can talk about, and I don't have all the details, but it is my understanding that Zions Bank, I actually do know this part, was the original creator of the remote check deposit. They have the patent. They had to go get a law passed that allowed remote checks to be accepted. And so Zions Bank said, okay, we have this. We think that if we capture images of checks, and therefore we can prove that the money's there. Now, if any of you are Zions Bank customers, you would know that Zions Bank has not been on the forefront of allowing customers to deposit remote checks. And this is where it kind of gets a little fuzzy, but I think I have a general idea of this. They created this service and they thought it was just for small businesses, and they included all these scanners that they could sell to them or give to them, and then they could, basically offset that cost of tellers taking all these deposits, and people could just put these checks through scanners. And I believe it was USAA, which has this armed forces kind of customer base. They said, well, this is really helpful for us. They saw the value in this technology, so I believe they licensed this from Zions Bank. And I think Chase got on board with this as well. And what was interesting was Zions, in terms of the real application of this, which was the consumer application, were one of the last people in that space, because they didn't pay attention to their consumers early enough to say, okay, this is actually who would really benefit from this. And so in a technology they developed, they're one of the last adopters of it, which is kind of an interesting, I think, case study. Now, if anyone knows anyone in Zions, you might have gotten some of those things wrong, but generally that is, I believe, what occurred in that space. And it was because they had created cool technology, like Matt talked about, but then they became so hyper-focused on the way they thought it was applied that they didn't see, what other avenues there could be there for that. So, I mean, in this space, you guys are a lot of you are in research space. By all means, research, like experiment with things. But I think it requires you to stop at some point and say, okay, we've gotten some kind of, this is working in some regard. Now let's really be creative and think about all the incredibly weird places that this could be adopted. And then some of those weird ideas might be helpful in terms of saying, okay, this might be a stepping stone, like what was discussed before. This might be another way that we can employ this technology. And maybe you're bound in some regards by like rules of some grants or something like that. But generally, that would be how I would approach that kind of iterative, innovative process. I hope that was helpful. It's like in Zoom, you just have all these like no responses. So I'm either just like way out there, or you guys are like, he's so amazing. We can't believe we have this opportunity to be with him. So I'll accept the second one.
I think this has been helpful. I really don't think from I don't know, when we're doing research, I rarely think of the customer. I feel like that's not like a perspective that is talked about, or at least like we're thinking more broadly in the sense of, okay, here's what we think the future needs, and here's the products we're designing for the future. But I guess in ways we are still considering the customer, as Regan mentioned with Kenworth, and even with like thinking about utilities as customers and how they uh, would interact with our products and how we can make our products beneficial for the utilities that are adopting them. So it's really interesting to think of that. And I think in our case, a lot of the customers aren't necessarily the actual people buying the EVs, but more the people buying the electric vehicle infrastructure. So it's like our customers are companies rather than individuals, which I also think is an interesting perspective. I guess, in your opinion, is it different to look at the customers that are companies versus customers as individuals? Is there a different way to do product design in that way?
Yeah, there is. So I think one of the things, I use the word customer to connect this with the idea of business as a framework. I think a better word to use generally is the word end user. And then you define who that end user is. Because in the end, if you have something of value, when we think about customer, we think about someone who's paying for something. We can figure out someone to pay for something. And so I would say, okay, who are the end users in this regard? The second part of that is your question about, is it different to think about business to business basically, or business to, say, community or government versus a consumer? And again, a lot of people in my space would say, no, there's not, because it's just people on either end. And absolutely, it's different in that in a business to consumer space, you're usually a lot more, subjective, emotional, and you have the ability to say no to things as well. Whereas in a business to business space, usually your value, basically your value calculation, is based off of how it helps you in terms of generating more profits or being more efficient or whatever. And so in a business to business space, you're allowed to, the conversation is usually easier because it can be much more analytical. It's less likely to be faddish and trendish, which for good or for bad, but it is something that you can work with your customer a lot more deeply, and you can kind of design solutions for them. The other side of that is the actual sales process is a lot easier typically in that space, because any sort of like sales process is always sales, whether it's a dedicated rep or it's like online ads. It's just different ways to sell something. When you're doing an online or more of a general mass market approach, you're just kind of guessing and testing these ideas. But in anything that is like, in terms of like a high cost, you get to have the luxury of employing people to connect with the consumer or the end user and find out exactly what they need. And the last thing I would say with this is that the one thing that you might consider, though, is that in that end user space, when we think business to business, we tend to think about businesses as kind of this huge organization like Kenworth, as we were describing, but it's not Kenworth, it's a few people who are affected by this. And so you want to think about the ways that they're being affected by this solution, right? Maybe it's a technician, or maybe it's somebody that's running their, directing their operations. And so in terms of the jobs to be done, there's some other jobs that exist that we don't talk about. And these jobs basically are, how does it help me to do my other jobs? So that's primarily the business to business space, that there are these kind of functional jobs that say, okay, this allows me to do my other jobs better. So these are like these corollary spaces. So in that regard, business to business can be really helpful because there's the value kind of statement or calculation is usually a lot more clear, and the needs are a lot more defined because it's usually a need by a few committees or something. But what I would encourage you to do is to think like not like a huge organization, because there's people at Kenworth that honestly don't care anything about this, and then there's some people that really, really do care. And so when you're talking about the customer in that regard, it's actually probably about 5 or 6 people, including the end user, a champion, a compliance department, somebody with veto power, somebody who's championing this idea that's moving it through the organization. They're all involved in that decision. And some of them, like, honestly, less important than others. Like compliance's job is only to say no. And if you can stop them from saying no, then you've won, because they don't make decisions, they just stop decisions. You just don't make sure the veto power person doesn't get ticked off. And then the other people are the ones that are analyzing whether this, is generating value or not. It's the, what we'd call the buyer, right? Or the economic buyer, if you will. So yeah, your end user, your economic buyer, your champion, those are the people, your advocate internally, those are the people that you want to really, really think about. And what's fortunate is that, especially in something that has, like, in all respects, is very niche, that you say, okay, we've got 7 customers out there. You can probably look these people up and know a lot about them and talk to them, because they probably do care about the solution to their problem, and they'll probably work with you on that, because it's not as competitive as it is of, in a consumer product space. So anyway, that was a long answer, but I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thanks.
My lights are off. All right, anything else?
So I think at Aspire then, so at least in my mind, then it's pretty easy to get one prototype out, right? Because and convince somebody that that's a good decision to make, because then they get a lot of good PR, and they're seen as green, and they're seen as innovative, and they're at the forefront of this cool technology. And then if you fast forward 10 years, then you have this technology widely distributed, then it also makes sense, because now overall it's cheaper, and overall it's more efficient, and it's I don't know, more convenient. But then in the middle, then I think I struggle to see how to convince people to do something that at the beginning, until it gets to scale, then it's less convenient and it's more expensive. And like, how do you convince somebody to go through that valley of not getting all that much return before you get to the other end, when you get that convenience and that efficiency, but then you're no longer in the PR, we're the first out of the gate, look at what we did, sort of a stage. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a typical pathway for most new technologies, that you have this early stage of these early adopters, or that are willing to deal with the bugs a little bit. From what the director of the MIT program, Bill Allett, talks about this in his book, Disciplined Entrepreneurship, where he says those early adopters are actually, it's interesting that they're willing to pay more than you would expect, than you usually estimate. But there's also, it's a much smaller group than you expect. And so I think that, I think there's 2 sides to that. Is number one, I think you need to be very clear. This is about understanding what the customer is getting out of this. What they're looking for is for the benefits to outweigh the downside. That's what they're looking for. And with the assumption that you're not creating something that's making things worse or terribly expensive, but you're kind of working through things. Consumers tend to understand that, whether they're business to business or otherwise. If it's a new technology, we've dealt with bugs for a long time, and we tend to work with that. And so I would argue that a good customer service, which is interesting because we tend to think about this in terms of product, but your customer relationship is really, really important in this regard. There's kind of an interesting study that that companies that have had customers that have had negative experience with companies, and the companies have made things right, are more loyal to a company than customers who've had no negative experiences with the company and things have just gone well. And so the idea that like if things are going to go bad and you'll take care of me, that people tend to connect with that, I think, in a real way.
I see.
Yeah. And I would say one last thing, which is interesting. We talk about minimum viable product and we talk about it a lot of different ways, but one of the examples to this is, I think, is Amazon. When they started selling books, that they didn't have books when they started selling books or the right to distribute books. They just had a website. And what I think they understood was that the thing that they were trying to sell was not books at all, but the willingness of people to buy books in the late 90s and online. That was like really what they were trying to sell, because people weren't willing to do that. And so they said, okay, let's just see if this works. Let's put minimal effort into this. And then I think they sold their first book was like a book about math, and they had to go and find that book. They didn't make any money on it for a long time, but they were trying to change behavior. And so their willingness to not take profit for a while allowed people to like really kind of invest in saying, okay, this is worth trying this out. And so if you can zero in on the real value that people are getting at and try and deliver that really effectively, as opposed to trying to create the whole solution at the very beginning, it might smooth things over in terms of those early adopters saying, okay, this is accomplishing that one major problem that I have. And then you add kind of the additional benefits or bells and whistles later on. So those are some things I could see from, examples in the industry, in different industries, that might be helpful in that space. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm not a, marketing guy. I'm just an engineer developing the technology. And so I'm not super involved in this space of who and when and where is the adoption. But I think that is very helpful to me, knowing where this stuff I'm developing is going to go and how. That's very helpful. Thank you.
you're welcome. I don't think there's been very many people in the history of the world that said, I'm not a marketer, I'm just a engineer. I think the other way. All right. Anything else? No. Well, if that's it. My goal is that this is helpful for you. I hope that we can see the examples as metaphors about, really focusing on the customer need and really having the customer or the end user kind of central to all of our innovation and creativity, our thought process, our brainstorming. When we do that, I think it gives us something that's has a much higher chance of success and viability. And I think that's the goal of all the people on this call, is that you want to create something that has an impact. I'm sure many of you want to be rich too and have something like that. But in the end, if we want to create something that changes the way the world is run or changes the way that life's run, we've got to kind of be a part of the world. We've got to be a part of those lives, and so that we can affect some real change in those spaces. So.
Great reminder for us, Russell. And we certainly pitch that that's what we're here for, is to have positive impact in the world. Good point. If we're not in the world, we're not going to get there. Excellent lecture and discussion. You knocked it out of the park. That's exactly what we were looking for.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for participating and really engaging so that we could make this a good discussion. Russell, thank you again. I know this took your time, and really appreciate your willingness to support us. And we'll go ahead and let you go. I know it's late in the evening. Thanks again to everyone.
Thanks.
We'll see you.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Well done. Thank you. Bye.